Let's look at the very curious case of death by medieval knife in a sack. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So here I've got a couple of medieval daggers. This is an eating knife set and this is a big rondel dagger. We'll talk a bit more about those in a second. I was in the process of researching some stuff for a video I'm planning relating to Todd's recent Arrows versus Armour 2. If you haven't seen that already, go and watch that now. However, I was researching on a website I use quite a lot, which is called British History Online. I've got a subscription to it, and it's got tons and tons and tons of medieval sources on it. So I was researching stuff to do with a video that I'm proposing to do in relation to Todd's recent series of videos. But I stumbled across something else, as you often do when you're looking for historical sources of one thing. You find something really interesting that's completely unrelated. And I thought, rather than just sticking it on the Facebook page, link below, or anything like that, Twitter or something like this, I thought I'd do a quick video about it. So this should be fairly brief, hopefully. So I found this, as I say, in British History Online, BHO, and it's recorded in a book that was published in 1904, over 100 years ago now, which is called The Calendar of Papal Registers Relating to Great Britain and Ireland, Volume 5, 1398 to 1404. So we're talking about something here which is actually quite close to the Battle of Agincourt, about 10 years before. That was published by His Majesty's Stationery Office in London, 1904. So, scrolling down to the source here, it's an account essentially of a criminal proceedings that happened. It's an account of something bad that happened, also slightly amusing, also slightly grim, and it relates to medieval daggers and violence. So I knew that you guys would want to hear all about it. So, it says this was in May 1401. So in May 1401, to John Parker, rector of Snaves in the Diocese of Canterbury, which is in Kent, in south east England, absolution from the guilt of homicide. So he's being forgiven for the act of homicide. So he killed someone and he has been found not guilty. Rehabilitation on account of irregularity contracted and dispensation to minister in his priest's orders. So, here's the account of what happened. So, riding on business, accompanied by a servant lent by one of his friends. A very nice friend, it'll lend you your servant. Got to remember that servants, obviously, slavery wasn't really a thing. At this point, the Normans pretty much abolished slavery in England. However, servants were a thing, and as we're going to see, servants weren't anything like slaves. They had certain rights, legal rights, and so on and so forth. They were sometimes lowly, sometimes middle class. Servant can mean anything. A civil servant could work for the government. You could have servants who are actually quite important. So we don't really know anything about the social status of this person. And as we will see, despite the fact that they were servant, they weren't afraid to stand up for themselves. So a servant lent by one of his friends, he wished to leave the inn where he'd had at first put up in order to go to another, and ordered the servant to bring out the horses. Bring out the horses, my man. The servant, taking this ill, in other words, the servant was in a bad mood for some reason that's not explained, mounted one and led the other by the hand. So he's riding one horse and leading the other one, pulling it along, presumably by the reins. And in going out of the stable door, some arrows, which after the manner of the English he carried in his belt, were partly broken and partly destroyed. Now, that's hugely interesting because it tells us that the servant was armed. And given that this is 1401, we know that the typical armour, if you look at Chaucer, for example, the typical armament of English men at this time was a longbow and arrows, sheaf of arrows. And clearly this guy's got arrows, so you would imagine he's got a bow somewhere as well. And very often a dagger, very often a sword, and very often a sword and buckler. If we look at Chaucer, quite a few of them are carrying swords and bucklers. And incidentally, this is in Canterbury as well, so it relates to Chaucer quite nicely. So Also interesting to note that the arrows are pushed through the belt. Now, this is something we see in numerous medieval images of archers. So he hasn't got a quiver, he hasn't got the sheath carried in any kind of device. They're literally shoved through the belt, which is interesting for anyone reenacting this period or looking at the art or anything like that. So he was clearly annoyed by this, wishing as his friend had begged him on account of the servant's bad temper, so it's a bad-tempered servant, to correct him, so to tell him off. John chided him for not leaving the inn on foot, because he went on horse, and dragged him from his horse by the arm. So he basically assaulted him, in modern legal terminology, without any notable hurt, however. So he pulled him off a horse, but didn't injure him. Whereupon the servant struck him in the face with the arrows. So this is a really badly tempered servant. He's like, I have broken my arrows and now you pulled me off the horse. You can imagine the words he used. And he struck John, his master, in the face with the arrows. John snatched them out of his hands and smote him somewhat with his fist. Interesting account of punching there, okay? If we look at medieval martial arts in the treatises, there's a massive emphasis on wrestling. We don't see much striking with the fists, but we know that they did it, and here it is described explicitly. Whereupon the servant, seizing a small bag in which John had put a pair of shoes and 2 knives unsheathed, hit him with the bag. Now, so here are sheath knives. Now, probably, as it doesn't say dagger or anything like that, probably we're talking about this. So what this is this is actually from Todd's workshop. So the second mention in this video. So that is a typical eating knife. Now you can see that whilst it is very different to anything like a rundle dagger, you could clearly hurt someone with one, and these are specifically described as a pair of, so this is actually called a pricker. So this is the equivalent of the knife and fork set. So you stab and eat with one, you cut with the other. Imagine 2 of these inside the bag, okay? And they could be larger, they could be smaller in some cases, not usually much smaller than this, but they could be potentially larger than this. And these are, for some reason, unsheathed inside the bag. So the servant basically struck him with it. Somewhat angered on account of the bystanders and his friends, John seized the bag and, remembering his friend's words but forgetting the knives inside, beat the servant several times so that he was wounded by the knives in the head and died a week afterwards. Well, there you go, you know, don't keep your unsheathed knives in a sack, number one. Probably don't pull servants off horses by their arms. Don't employ angry servants in the first place. And when all of this goes to crap, don't beat them around the head with a sack that contains unsheathed knives. So he died a week afterwards, for which John is extremely sorry. I'm sure he is extremely sorry because he ended up in court. He's already had absolution by authority of the ordinary form from the guilt of homicide and has therefore taken part in divine offices. Now, I'm not sure what that means exactly, but does that mean he became a clergyman? I don't know. But anyway, if he did, then I guess he was extremely sorry. Anyway, I'm not going to blather on anymore, but very, very interesting account and reminder that very often knife crime in the medieval age, and this isn't exactly knife crime, but it's an interesting example of someone being killed by knives unintentionally, allegedly. It didn't always involve something like a whopping great rondel dagger or bullock knife or anything like that. Sometimes, and probably statistically the most often, it was with the humble eating knife. Just like today, when 80% of crime is done with kitchen knives because they're the most widely available knives and will always be available no matter what the laws are, because every kitchen is full of knives and is now and was then. I hope this has been an interesting historical account. I know you like these little nuggets of history, and given that this was going to go ignored and forgotten by modern historians and viewers of YouTube, if I had scrolled on and clicked to the next page, I thought I should immortalise it here on screen. Thanks a lot for watching. Check out Todd's Arrows vs Armour 2 videos, and I will be doing some related videos soon, so watch out for those. Hope to see you back on the channel. Cheers, folks.